Okay, this is section 9.1. We're going to be solving quadratic equations by finding square roots. This is going to be a method that we start to use when we can't always factor our polynomials. So, quick review. 3 squared, well that's 3 times 3, so that's going to give me 9. Negative 3 squared, well it's negative 3 times negative 3. Two negatives make a positive, so that's also positive 9. 4 squared, 16. Negative 4 squared, also 16. This is really important because we're going to be taking the square roots, and when we take the square roots we need to see what's possible to make these guys up. Okay, whenever we're talking about these solutions, all positive real numbers are going to have 2 square roots. So I could be looking for a positive square root, which would be notated by the square root symbol. I could be looking for the negative square root, which would be notated by the negative square root sign. Or I could be looking for the positive negative, so that'll just have plus, minus, and then our square root symbol. Okay, one thing that's crazy important for you to remember is negative numbers have no real square root. They do have a square root, it's just not real. Okay, we also need to know what the parts of this are called. So this symbol is called the radical. Now the number that's inside the radical is called the radicand. Okay, now what's the square root of 9? Okay, well that's 3. What's the negative square root of 9? Well, the square root of 9 is 3. The negative square root of that's negative 3. Okay, what's plus or minus the square root of 9? Oh, well that's plus or minus the square root of 3. Square root of 64, what's that? Okay, that gives me 8. Square root of negative 4. Oh, this one has no real solution because I cannot take the square root of a negative number. Now what's the square root, the plus or minus the square root of 0.25? Well, that's plus or minus 0.5. Okay, now when we're doing these, you're going to notice that we have 2 types of solutions. We could have a perfect square root. When I take the square root of 25, I get this nice, pretty, just plain old number 5. Or I could have an irrational square root. Now if I have an irrational square root, when I take the square root of 6, notice I get this big long drawn out decimal. Let's see, what was that again? 2.4494. So 2.4494. Now that's an irrational number. It doesn't have an ending point. This decimal is going to go on for a long time. Now another thing that we're going to need to be able to do is we're going to evaluate radical expressions. Now b squared minus 4ac should look familiar to you. Okay, when you see that, you should go, oh yeah, that's the discriminant. When I can take the square root of that, I know that whatever polynomial I'm trying to factor, that it'll factor. But we need to make sure that we can evaluate these guys. So you've got your numbers a, b, and c. So we're going to say, okay, I've got the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times my a value, which is 1, times my c value, which is negative 3. Got to make sure that my radical goes all the way over all of that. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through and I'm going to evaluate this by hand. I'm not going to plug it into my calculator until the very end. And then only if I need to. Negative 2 squared, it's in parentheses, so I know that's going to give me a positive 4. Minus, well 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times negative 3 is negative 12. So I've got 4 minus negative 12. Well, 2 negatives make a positive. So 12 plus 4 is going to give me the square root of 16. And oh, square root of 16, that's 4. These types of problems, I want you to do as much as you possibly can by hand, because when you plug them into your calculator may not always give you what you need. Okay, now another thing we're going to be doing is we're going to need to evaluate. And we're going to round our answer to the nearest hundredth. That's 2 places past the decimal. So now notice I've got this plus or minus sign. So I'm going to have to do the positive version. So I've got 1 plus 2 times the square root of 3 divided by 4. And I also have 1 minus 2 times the square root of 3 divided by 4. Now remember when we were factoring those quadratic equations, we had 2 answers, x equals this or x equals this. Same thing here. We're going to have 2 solutions because of this plus or minus. We've got to see what happens if I add 2 times the square root of 3. What happens if I subtract 2 times the square root of 3? Again, I want you to do as much as you can by hand. So 1 plus 2 times the square root of 3, well, that I'm just going to have to plug into my calculator. So when I plug this in, I'm going to ask that you plug in this top portion, hit equals, and then hit divide by 4. And we're going to take this equal sign away because we're approximating, so it's going to be approximately 1.12. Now let's plug the second one in. I've got 1 minus 2 times the square root of 3. Plug that in. I hit equals, then hit your divide button, 4, and that's going to be approximately negative 0.62. Okay, now let's take a look at the steps that are used to solve equations that have x squared equals d. That means our x squared is my only variable, or y squared or b squared or whatever variable you're working with. There is no b term anywhere. The first thing you're going to do is get the x squared term by itself. Make sure it's on one side of the equal sign with nobody else. Then you need to take the square root of both of those sides. Then you've got to state your solution. Now if your number, after you take the square root of it, is positive, or if your d value is positive, you're going to have 2 solutions. So x is going to be plus or minus whatever this number is that you take the square root of. If your d value is negative, you will have no real solution. You have a solution, it's just not real. You'll get to that in Algebra 2. If d is 0, you have one solution, and it's real nice and handy. It's just x is equal to 0. So let's take a look at this one. I have 3x squared minus 48 is equal to 0. Well, the first thing I've got to do is I've got to get my x squared term by itself. So I am going to add 48 to both sides. So now I have 3x squared is equal to 48. Well, x squared's not by itself yet. Now I've got to divide both sides by positive 3. Now x squared is equal to, let's see, 48 divided by 3. I believe that gives me 16. Okay, I've got x squared and I've got 16. What am I going to do? Now I'm just going to take the square root of it. So now I've got x is equal to plus or minus 4. This plus or minus is really, really important. Make sure you have that in your solution. Okay, now here is one more. This one just looks ugly. It's not really any worse than the other one. A lot of you are looking at that fraction and going, oh no, I don't know how to do that. But you've done this exact same problem before. First thing we're going to do is what? Subtract 12 from both sides. Okay, and 7 minus 12 gives me negative 5. So now I have 4/5 x squared is equal to negative 5. Now remember, what do I do if I have a fraction for my coefficient? Well, 4/5 is multiplied by x squared, so I'm going to divide. But whenever I divide with a fraction, what am I really doing? I'm really multiplying by the reciprocal, so those guys are going to cancel out. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So now I have x squared is equal to negative 25 over 4. Oh, what do I know about my answer right now? I don't even have to worry that I've got a fraction right here. This number is negative, so I have no real solution. Okay, and that's it.